The text came in at 6:47 on a Thursday evening, right in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner, while my daughter was passing the cranberry sauce across the table, and Derek was telling a story about his golf game that nobody had asked to hear. I almost didn't feel the buzz. My phone was in my shirt pocket, the way I always carry it since my wife passed 4 years ago, old habit, because she used to call me at the strangest hours just to say she was thinking about me. These days it mostly vibrates for pharmacy reminders and weather alerts. But this one was different. I could feel that somehow, even before I looked at it, the way you sometimes sense a change in the air before the rain actually arrives. I slipped it out under the table, keeping my eyes on Derek's face while he laughed at his own punchline. The message was from Frank Kowalski, my neighbor of 22 years, the man who still mows a clean strip along my property line every Saturday morning without ever being asked. Frank is 71, a retired bank examiner, and he does not text. He has told me this himself on multiple occasions. He says texting is for people who are afraid of actual conversation. The message said, "Walter, don't react. Excuse yourself from the table and call me right now. Do not say anything to Derek. This is serious." I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on my thigh and picked up my fork and took a slow bite of sweet potato casserole that tasted like nothing at all. Derek was still talking. My daughter Karen was laughing at something he'd said, and her laugh, the one I'd known since she was 7 years old, sounded so ordinary and warm and completely at home in my dining room that I had to look away from her. I said I thought I'd left the oven on. Just that. Nobody questioned it. I walked through the kitchen, through the back hallway, and out the side door into the cold November air. My hands were steadier than I expected them to be. I dialed Frank before I'd even pulled the door fully shut behind me. He answered on the first ring. "How long has Derek been handling your accounts?" he said. "No, hello." I told him a little over 2 years. Since just after Karen's wedding, when Derek had sat down with me at this very dining room table with a yellow legal pad and a warm, reasonable voice, and explained that a man with my assets, the house, the pension, the retirement accounts, really ought to have a proper estate plan in place. He'd offered to help me set it up. He was a financial advisor, after all. He knew people, he said. He could make a few calls. And I was still raw from losing Eleanor, still moving through those early months where paperwork felt like swimming through concrete. So I'd said yes. I'd signed things. I trusted him. He was my daughter's husband. Frank went quiet for a moment when I told him that, the particular quiet of someone doing math in their head. He told me he'd run into their mutual banker that afternoon, a woman named Carol, who used to process loans at First Meridian before she moved to the new branch on Elm. Frank and Carol had worked together years ago. They'd gotten to talking in the parking lot of the grocery store, the way people do when they haven't seen each other in a while. And Carol had mentioned, without mentioning any names, just in the way of general professional frustration, that she'd been seeing a pattern lately with certain accounts. Power of attorney arrangements where the authorized party had been making withdrawals that didn't match the account holder's established behavior. Large, irregular transfers. Multiple instances. Carol hadn't said my name. She didn't have to. Frank knew I'd given Derek some form of financial authority. He'd seen the paperwork on my kitchen counter once, 18 months ago, and he'd asked me about it, and I'd told him it was just estate planning. Don't worry. He'd said okay, but he'd had a look on his face that I didn't fully register at the time. "Walter," Frank said, "I need you to go to your bank tomorrow morning. First thing, before you do anything else. Do not tell Karen. Do not tell Derek. Just go and ask them to print you a complete transaction history for every account under your name or jointly authorized. Every single one." I told him I would. "And tonight," he said, "act normal. Can you do that?" I thought about Derek's voice carrying through the house, that easy, confident voice, and my daughter laughing, and the cranberry sauce still sitting in the bowl. I told him I could. I went back inside and finished Thanksgiving dinner. I ate a second piece of pie. I told Derek the story was funny about the golf game. I told Karen the sweet potato casserole was the best she'd ever made. I hugged them both at the door at 9:15 and watched the taillights of their car disappear at the end of the street, and then I stood in my front hallway for a long time without moving. I did not sleep that night. Not really. I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around me and tried to build a case against believing what Frank had implied. I went through the reasons it couldn't be true. Derek was arrogant sometimes, yes, and he talked too much. And there was something about the way he looked at my house, at the bookshelves, at the crown molding, At the fireplace Eleanor and I had picked out together that had always felt slightly like inventory, but I'd called that my own suspicion. My own grief, making me see things that weren't there. Except I had noticed, about 8 months ago, that my monthly statement from one of my brokerage accounts seemed lower than I expected. I'd mentioned it to Derek, and he'd nodded patiently and explained that the market had been volatile, that I shouldn't panic, that he was managing things with a long-term view. I'd accepted that because I didn't know enough to argue, and because he used words that made me feel like questioning him would be embarrassing. And 3 months after that, I'd noticed my home equity line of credit, the one I'd opened years ago for the kitchen renovation and never really touched, showed a balance I didn't recognize. I'd asked Derek about that too. He'd told me he'd taken a small draw on my behalf to cover some rebalancing fees and that it would be returned within the quarter. He'd said it with the kind of calm that makes you feel like the unreasonable one for asking. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer. I have calculated load tolerances for buildings that are still standing. I am not confused. I am not forgetful. I have never in my adult life needed someone to explain my own finances back to me in a tone normally reserved for children. I was at First Meridian when they opened their doors at 9. The woman at the customer service desk was maybe 35, professional and unhurried. I told her I wanted a full transaction history, every account, and I wanted to sit somewhere quiet and go through it before I left. She gave me a small conference room and a cup of coffee and came back 15 minutes later with a folder that was thicker than I expected. I read every page. It took me an hour and 40 minutes. By the end, I had identified 43 transactions I did not recognize or authorize. The pattern was clean and deliberate, never large enough in a single month to trigger an automatic alert, always just under the thresholds Derek would have known about from his professional training. Transfers to an LLC I'd never heard of, 2 draws on the home equity line totaling just over $90,000, a liquidation of part of my retirement account that I had absolutely never approved, structured to look like a rebalancing move inside the paperwork. The total, when I added it up on the margin of the last page with a pen the woman had left on the table, was $212,000 over 26 months. I sat with that number for a while. Then I took the folder, thanked the woman, and called Frank from the parking lot. He picked up immediately. I could hear him putting on his coat even before I finished talking. We met at his kitchen table, the one where his wife used to make pierogi every Christmas before she passed. And Frank spread the documents out and put on his reading glasses and went through everything I'd marked. He did it slowly and carefully, the way he'd done this for 30 years professionally. And when he finished, he took off his glasses and set them on the table and said, "You need an attorney, and you need to call the Elder Financial Abuse Unit at the County Sheriff's Office. Today." In that order. I told him I wanted to be certain before I did anything. He tapped the papers. "You are certain," he said. "You've been certain since last night. You just needed to see it on paper." He was right. I knew it the same way I knew when a structural calculation was wrong, not dramatically, not with alarms going off, but with a quiet, settled wrongness that made the whole design unworkable. I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia, who had handled Eleanor's estate and who I'd always liked for her directness. She told me to come in that afternoon and to bring everything. I told her I wanted to do this carefully. I told her I did not want a premature confrontation that would give anyone the chance to move assets or destroy records. She said that was exactly the right instinct, and that she would make a call to someone she knew at the County Financial Crimes Unit before I arrived. I did not call Karen. This is the part that I will carry for the rest of my life, heavier than the money, heavier than any of it. Because Karen did not know. I am almost entirely certain she did not know. The way she'd laughed at Thanksgiving, the ease of her, the ordinary warmth, I do not believe you can fake that so completely. But I also knew that if I called her, she would go to Derek. Not out of malice, but out of marriage, out of reflex, out of 27 months of trusting her husband the same way I had. And if Derek knew, things would disappear. So I said nothing to my daughter for 11 days. 11 days during which I answered Derek's calls about a portfolio review he wanted to schedule. 11 days during which I went to Patricia's office twice more and to the county building once and gave a statement that took 3 hours. 11 days during which I did not sleep more than 4 hours at a stretch and ate things I don't remember eating and walked through my house at night, touching the bookshelves and the fireplace mantel and the framed photograph of Eleanor in the hallway, and understanding for the first time how close I'd come to losing all of it. The house had already been positioned. That was what Patricia told me on the 8th day, sitting across from me with a particular steadiness in her expression that told me she was giving me hard news as gently as she knew how. Derek had taken out a second draw on the home equity line 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, $94,000, the bulk of my remaining accessible equity, and had moved it through the LLC into a second structure. Patricia's contact was still unraveling. The working theory was that he had been planning to move on the house itself within the next 60 to 90 days. He had been going to take my house. The house Eleanor and I had bought in 1987. The house where Karen had grown up and where I had every intention of growing old. The house where Frank still mows the property line every Saturday without being asked. I sat in Patricia's office and looked at the wall and thought about the legal pad Derek had brought to that dinner table 2 years ago. The warm, reasonable voice, the way he'd framed it all as doing me a favor. I thought about how I'd felt grateful. I'd actually felt grateful. On the 11th day, a Tuesday morning in early December, 2 investigators and Patricia went to Derek's office. I was not there for this part. I was home, at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee, waiting. Frank came over and sat with me. Patricia called at 11:43 to tell me Derek had been taken in for questioning and that a preservation order had been placed on all affected assets pending a full investigation. She said it in her clear, direct way, and I wrote down the specific phrases she used because I wanted to have them exactly right for when I talked to Karen. Karen called me at 12:19. She was crying before I said anything. She'd already gotten a call from the investigators asking her to come in voluntarily, and they had told her enough that she understood. I listened to her cry, and I did not try to fill the silence with reassurance I didn't have. Eventually, she asked me why I hadn't told her, and I told her the truth that I needed to keep it quiet long enough to protect what was left, and that I was sorry for the 11 days. She came over that afternoon. She sat at my kitchen table, in the same chair she'd sat in every morning growing up, eating cereal before school, and I sat across from her, and we didn't talk for a long time. Then she asked if I was going to be all right financially, and I told her yes, that Patricia believed the preservation order covered most of what had been moved, and that the equity draws on the house could likely be unwound through the legal process. She asked if I was going to lose the house. I told her no. I told her I was not going to lose the house. She put her face in her hands and cried again, and I moved my chair around and put my arm around my daughter and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at the maple tree we'd planted the year she was born that was now 32 feet tall, and I let her cry as long as she needed to. Derek was charged with elder financial abuse, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraudulent misuse of power of attorney. The full accounting took several more months to complete. The LLC had been used as a pass-through for funds ultimately deposited into accounts in Derek's name that Karen had known nothing about. Patricia's contact at the Financial Crimes Unit told me, without particular surprise in her voice, that this was not an unusual pattern, that the access and trust inherent in family financial arrangements made them one of the most common vehicles for this type of fraud, that the people who did this were typically very good at appearing reasonable. I thought about that word, reasonable, the legal pad and the calm explanations and the voice that made you feel embarrassed for asking. Yes, he had been very good at appearing reasonable. What I want you to understand, and I mean you specifically, if you are someone who has given a family member or a son-in-law or a trusted anyone control over your accounts because it felt like the practical thing to do, because estate planning made sense, because you didn't want to be the kind of person who made things difficult, what I want you to understand is that I am not a man who was confused or careless or diminished by age. I am 67 years old, and I have been making sound decisions for 4 decades. The reason it worked was not because I was vulnerable in the way people imagine when they hear a story like this. It worked because I trusted, and because the fraud was engineered specifically to stay beneath the level of what I would notice in any given month. It worked because I was reasonable. What stopped it? The only thing that stopped it before the house was gone too was Frank Kowalski texting me from his kitchen on Thanksgiving afternoon, when he hates texting, because he knew me well enough to know I wouldn't believe him if he didn't have something solid. And he cared enough to make that call to Carol and put it together, and he understood that the moment to act was before anything else disappeared. Not a detective, not the bank, which had the data, and had not called me, not the regulatory systems that are theoretically in place. A 71-year-old retired bank examiner who mows my property line out of habit and friendship. I review every single transaction in every account now. Every month, without exception. I sit at this kitchen table with a cup of coffee and I go through every line. I have a direct relationship with a woman at First Meridian named Carol, the same Carol who'd spoken to Frank in the parking lot, who I contacted after everything settled to thank her, and who told me firmly and kindly that I was under no circumstances to give signing authority over my accounts to anyone without an independent attorney reviewing the arrangement. First, I have not given anyone signing authority over my accounts. I make my own decisions about my own money. I live in my own house, with the fireplace Eleanor and I chose together, and the maple tree in the yard, and the framed photograph in the hallway. Last Saturday, Frank mowed the strip along the property line the same way he always does, and when he finished, I brought out 2 cups of coffee and we sat on the back steps the way we have on and off for 22 years, and neither of us talked about any of this directly. We talked about the maple tree and whether it needed trimming and what the winter was supposed to be like. Some things don't need to be said because they're already understood. Karen is in therapy and is filing for divorce. She calls me every Sunday evening, the same time she called her mother every Sunday evening growing up, and we talk for 30 or 40 minutes about ordinary things, and at the end, she always tells me she loves me, and I always tell her the same. I do not know yet what the next years look like for her, but I know she is tougher than this, because I know where she comes from. I am 67 years old. I built things for 31 years that are still standing. My brains work fine, thank you, and the next time someone sits down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a warm, reasonable voice, and offers to help me manage my own affairs, I will be very polite, and I will show them to the door, and I will call Patricia in the morning. That is not bitterness. That is clarity. There is a difference, and I have paid enough to know it.